The sun had barely risen above the jagged ridges of the Arizona frontier when Jacob Hensley tightened the worn leather strap of his hat and guided his horse along the rocky trail that followed the Verde River. He was a rancher by trade, not a wealthy one, but a man hardened by the wilderness and carved into something resilient by the years of solitude. His ranch sat several miles south, a modest spread of dry grassland and wooden fences, but Jacob often came north to the river to check his snares, fish a little, and let his cattle drink from the cleaner streams that branched off. Life was rough but simple, and that morning promised nothing unusual, just another scorching day of desert heat and the endless hum of cicadas echoing off the canyon walls. But fate has a peculiar way of weaving extraordinary events into the fabric of ordinary days, and by evening Jacob's world would be forever altered. As he reached a bend in the river, Jacob noticed something unusual. The water churned violently, as though some massive log had been swept into the current. But then he saw it wasn't wood at all. It was a figure, large and powerful, struggling against the river's pull. At first he thought it must be a man, but as he urged his horse closer and jumped down to the bank, his eyes widened. It was a woman, an Apache woman, and not just any woman but a giant compared to most. She towered even as the river tossed her, her shoulders broad, her arms thrashing against the foaming water like tree limbs fighting a storm. Her long black hair streamed out like a banner of midnight, tangling and whipping as she gasped for air. Jacob hesitated only for a breath. The Apaches were feared in those parts, warriors, fierce and territorial. A white rancher like him had little business getting tangled up with them, much less with one of their women. But humanity overrode caution. He could not watch someone drown, no matter who they were. With a sharp tug, he stripped his boots and dove into the icy water. The current slammed against him like a charging bull, dragging him downstream as his lungs filled with the raw scent of mud and riverweed. The woman's eyes were wide with panic, and though her size gave her strength, it was clear she was moments from being pulled under. Jacob kicked hard, cutting through the water until he reached her. She flailed, nearly striking him, but he shouted above the roar, "Hold still. I'll get you to shore." Whether she understood his English or only the tone of his voice, something in her movements shifted, less wild, more desperate trust. He hooked an arm around her chest, feeling the sheer weight of her body dragging him downward, and with a mighty heave began to swim toward the bank. The struggle seemed endless, every stroke a battle against both water and exhaustion. His muscles screamed, and more than once he thought they would both be lost, swallowed whole by the river's merciless grip. But with a final surge, he pushed her onto the muddy bank, collapsing beside her, both gasping like fish torn from the deep. For a long while neither spoke, the only sound their ragged breathing and the rush of the river behind them. Jacob propped himself on his elbows, watching her. She was magnificent, in a way that startled him. Taller than most men he knew, her frame was sculpted with strength yet carried a strange grace even in exhaustion. Her dark eyes flickered open, studying him with equal parts suspicion and wonder. She coughed, spitting water, then pressed a hand to her chest as if to reassure herself she was alive. Jacob sat up, wiping mud from his face. "You're safe now," he said softly, though he doubted she understood. She blinked at him, her lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Instead she sat upright, towering over him, even seated, and regarded him with a solemn intensity that made his heartbeat quicken. For a moment Jacob thought she might strike him, repay his rescue with the hostility her people often showed settlers. Instead, she simply touched her hand lightly to his shoulder, a gesture that felt like acknowledgement, even gratitude. Then, with surprising strength for someone just pulled from death's grip, she rose to her feet. Jacob followed, uneasy. She was barefoot, her clothes torn from the river's wrath, but she stood proud, like a warrior carved from stone. She glanced around as though seeking something, then turned back to him. "Nadi," she said in a deep, resonant voice. Jacob frowned. "What?" she repeated, pressing a hand to her chest. "Nadi. Apache." Then she pointed at him. "You, rancher." He blinked in surprise. So she knew some English, at least enough to name him. "Yes," he said slowly. "Rancher. My name's Jacob." She tilted her head, studying him. Then, without another word, she turned and began walking upriver. Jacob called after her, "Wait, you'll never make it alone, not in that state." But she did not slow, only glanced back once, her eyes catching his in a silent command that he could not read. And then she vanished into the trees, leaving him drenched, bewildered, and strangely restless. That night Jacob returned to his ranch, but his mind was anything but settled. He couldn't shake the image of her towering figure against the river, the fire in her eyes even as she fought for breath. He had saved many animals in his life, even a few men during the skirmishes that sometimes broke out along the frontier, but this felt different. He hadn't just pulled a stranger from danger, he had stepped into a story far larger than himself, though he couldn't yet see its shape. As the stars spread across the desert sky, Jacob sat by his small fire, staring into the flames. Somewhere out there, that Apache woman was alive because of him. And though logic told him to forget it, to let the wild keep its secrets, his heart whispered otherwise. Dawn came harsh and hot. Jacob rose early, tending his cattle, but his ears pricked at every sound, his eyes scanning the horizon as though expecting some sign. By midday, the unease grew heavy, and he found himself riding north again, back toward the river. Something urged him, a tug he couldn't explain. When he reached the bend where he'd saved her, the place was silent save for the rush of water. He dismounted, crouching to study the mud. There, prints. Large, human, unmistakable. Her prints. They led into the trees. He followed, careful, his rifle slung but not ready. The trail wound through underbrush and up a rise, and suddenly he froze. Before him stood a group of Apache warriors. At least 6 of them, their faces painted, bows and lances in hand. And in their midst, her. The giant woman. She stood tall among them, her eyes locked on Jacob as if she'd been waiting. His heart pounded. The warriors tensed, hands tightening on weapons. Jacob raised his hands slowly, showing he meant no harm. One of them barked in Apache, a sharp command, but she lifted her arm and silenced them. Then, in a voice that carried authority, she spoke to them, words Jacob could not understand. The warriors looked uncertain, exchanging glances. Then she stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Jacob's. "Jacob," she said, his name strange on her tongue yet clear enough. "You save me. My father no." Jacob blinked, confusion warring with apprehension. Her father. Who was her father? And why did it sound like both a promise and a warning? Before he could ask, the warriors formed around her, and with a sudden, fluid motion, they turned and vanished back into the forest, leaving him alone once more. Jacob stood there, the weight of her words heavy in his chest. My father no. He didn't yet realize that the next day would bring an encounter unlike any he had ever imagined, an encounter with the chief of her people, and with an unexpected reward that would test the very fabric of his soul. The following morning broke with a silence so profound that Jacob felt it in his bones, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. He had woken earlier than usual, restless from dreams in which the giant Apache woman's dark eyes kept pulling him into the river again and again, only for him to awaken drenched in sweat. His cattle lowed in the distance, but even they seemed uneasy, their movements slow and their heads lifting often toward the ridges that surrounded his ranch. Jacob saddled his horse but kept his rifle nearby, though not ready, for something inside him whispered that he would not need bullets today, only courage. As the sun cleared the hills, a ripple of movement appeared along the northern ridge, first just a shimmer of dust, then a line of figures. Jacob's chest tightened. There were more than a dozen Apache riders descending in measured silence, their horses moving as one, their presence as commanding as the mountains themselves. At their center rode a man who seemed carved from legend, tall, broad-shouldered, his head adorned with eagle feathers, his chest draped in beads and leather that spoke of power and age. His face bore the lines of countless seasons, yet his dark eyes burned with unyielding strength. And riding beside him, towering and radiant even in her simplicity, was the woman Jacob had saved. She rode proudly, her head high, her long black hair flowing, her expression unreadable, though her gaze fixed on him with that same unshakable intensity as before. Jacob stood at the edge of his corral, hands loose at his sides, heart pounding as the riders drew near. They stopped just short of his fence, dust rising around them like a veil. The chief dismounted slowly, every movement deliberate, commanding silence even from the restless horses. Jacob swallowed hard. He knew without needing to be told, this was her father, the leader of the band, the man whose word could mean Jacob's death or salvation. The giant woman dismounted next, standing beside her father, her presence like a shadow stretching across Jacob's land. The chief spoke first, his voice deep and resonant, though at first Jacob could not understand the words. Then the woman translated, her English broken but strong. My father is Taza. He is chief. He knows you saved me. He come to speak. Jacob nodded carefully, keeping his eyes on the chief. I did what any man would do, he said. I couldn't let her drown. She translated swiftly, and the chief listened, his face unreadable. Then he spoke again, longer this time, his tone shifting like the rumble of distant thunder. The woman's voice followed. Among my people, life is sacred. To save life is to earn life. My father says, you saved his daughter. You have honor. And for this, he gives reward. Jacob blinked, caught off guard. Reward. He hadn't expected gratitude, much less anything tangible. He had half expected a warning to stay away, or worse. But reward. He frowned, cautious. Tell your father I need no reward, he said slowly. I only did what was right. She translated, but the chief only shook his head, raising a hand. He gestured, and one of the warriors rode forward leading 2 magnificent horses, stallions unlike any Jacob had ever seen, their coats shimmering like polished bronze, their eyes sharp and proud. Jacob gasped softly. These were no ordinary animals, they were warhorses, bred for strength, speed, and endurance. In that land, a gift like this was worth more than gold. But the chief was not finished. He stepped closer, and his daughter followed. He placed a hand on her shoulder, speaking gravely. She translated again, her voice carrying both weight and strange softness. He says, horses are not enough. He gives you me. Jacob froze, the words striking him harder than any. Bullet. Gives me, you. He echoed. She nodded solemnly. Yes. Among my people, when a man saves a woman, her life belongs to him. My father says I am your wife, if you accept. The world tilted around Jacob, the desert heat spinning like fire in his lungs. He stared at her, this towering woman, fierce and beautiful in ways he could not fully grasp, and then at her father, whose steady gaze held no room for jest. It was not an offer. It was an honor. A bond. A binding of 2 worlds. Jacob's mind raced. To take her would mean alliance with her people, protection, even friendship where once there had been only suspicion and bloodshed. But it would also mean danger, anger from settlers who would not understand, a life forever tied to a culture not his own. And yet, looking at her, he saw no fear in her eyes. Only a strange calm, as though she had already accepted her fate, as though she knew something he did not. His voice caught in his throat. Tell your father, he began, then stopped, uncertain. The woman watched him, waiting. The chief stepped closer, his hand pressing firmly against Jacob's chest, right above his heart. He spoke a single phrase, and the woman whispered, he says, be brave. To save life is to carry life. Do not refuse gift. Jacob's heart thundered. He looked at her again, at the strength etched into every line of her face, the quiet fire behind her gaze. Slowly, almost against his own expectation, he nodded. I accept. She translated, and a ripple of approval moved through the warriors. The chief placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder now, gripping firmly, his eyes softening with something like respect. The woman stepped forward, closer than before, and for the first time a small, fleeting smile touched her lips. It was gone in an instant, but Jacob saw it, and it filled him with a warmth he could not explain. That night, after the Apache had gone, leaving the horses behind in a silence heavy with promise, Jacob sat by his fire again, but he was no longer alone. The giant woman sat across from him, her back straight, her presence filling the small camp like a mountain had chosen to rest there. They spoke little, her English was rough, his Apache non-existent, but words seemed unnecessary. There was an understanding between them, born in the river, sealed by her father's hand. Jacob knew his life had changed forever, not just by the gift of horses or the promise of safety, but by the bond now tethered to his very soul. He had set out that morning a solitary rancher, hardened by solitude. By nightfall, he had gained not only an unexpected wife, but also a place in a story larger than himself, a story that would ripple across the land like the river that had first bound them together. And as the firelight danced across her strong features, Jacob realized something that made his breath catch. The reward was not the horses, nor even the alliance. The true reward was her. Her courage, her strength, her quiet, unshakable spirit. She had been given to him as a gift, but in truth, she was no possession. She was a partner, a storm, a destiny. And in that moment, Jacob understood that sometimes the greatest treasures come not in gold or land, but in the unexpected bonds forged in the crucible of life and death. Tomorrow would bring challenges, questions, perhaps even danger from both sides of the world they now straddled. But tonight, as the stars wheeled overhead, Jacob felt only gratitude. He looked into her eyes, and though no words passed between them, he whispered softly into the night, "Thank you." Somewhere in the silence, he thought he heard the river answer, its eternal voice carrying promise and mystery. Stories like this remind us that courage and kindness can change destinies in ways we never expect. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales.